travel writer once wrote, "Lyme is full of painters and pictures. You find painters in force when the laurel is in bloom, or when the trees are not too green, and the place to find many of them is at Miss Florence's." The place called Miss Florence's was the Griswold boarding house located in the Connecticut village of Old Lyme, a quaint New England town located where the Connecticut River flows lazily into Long Island Sound. Often called a mansion or the Holy House, Miss Florence's was a grand house completed by 1817 and painted yellow with green shutters. The facade of the house is most impressive, with 4 tall white columns capped with ornate capitals, a massive pediment, and a fancy fan-shaped window. The big house looked like a Greek temple, half hidden among the elm trees along a quiet Connecticut lane. The Griswold family moved into the house in the 1840s. They used it as a day school for young ladies in the 1880s, but it became famous later for housing the painters of the Lyme Art Colony. The story of the Lyme Art Colony began in 1899 when a successful artist from New York City named Henry Ward Ranger visited Old Lyme and met Miss Florence Griswold. Ranger was looking for a town to establish an American art colony, a place where painters could live and work near one another, giving good-natured criticism and advice and learning from each other. He had been to Europe, where art colonies were common, or, as one artist put it, as thick as blackberries, and he wanted to start one in America. From his worldly experience, Ranger knew what was required. To be successful, an art colony had to be easy to get to, have a comfortable place to stay, be near interesting subject matter, have an inspired leader and like-minded followers, and offer a place to show and sell the finished paintings. The landscape around Old Lyme was perfectly suited to Ranger's interests, and it was easily reachable by trains from New York. But to begin his colony, Ranger needed a place where he and the other artists could stay. A friend of his recommended Miss Florence's boarding house. Florence Ann Griswold was born on Christmas Day in 1850. She was the youngest child of Captain Robert Griswold, a sea captain who sailed packet boats filled with parcels and people between New York and London. His career as a sea captain allowed the family the luxury of living in one of the biggest houses in town. Florence had 2 sisters and 1 brother and spent many happy years in the Griswold house. Miss Florence never married nor had children, and as time went on, she found herself almost alone in the big house. She surrounded herself with friendly cats and 2 or 3 servants to help her cook, clean, and do chores around the house. Florence decided to open her home as a boarding house, a place where guests and visitors could stay overnight and take their meals in the dining room. At the time, running a boarding house was a socially acceptable way for an unmarried woman to make a living and serve the needs of Americans who were increasingly traveling to small towns for rest and recreation. Ranger convinced Miss Florence to save rooms for his artist friends for the following year. True to his word, he returned in the summer of 1900 with a merry band of painters ready to capture the beauty of Old Lyme in paint. Although once a booming shipbuilding town, the village was quiet by the time the artists arrived. There were watery marshes with sandy beaches to the south and rocky hills and small rundown farms to the north. The overall feeling of an old-fashioned place was very attractive to the artists who wanted to paint pictures that captured a sense of the past. The old homes along the main street, the tall spire of the church, and timbered bridges spanning the slow-moving rivers caught their artistic imagination in the same way the cows, oxen, and sheep grazing on the nearby hillsides reminded them of simpler times. Paintings of these scenes were popular, especially with city people who were too busy to visit the country themselves. The artist Child Hassam called a visit to Old Lyme an excursion into Bohemia, meaning a journey to a place where it was acceptable to break the rules of polite society. Indeed, Miss Florence's was a place where artists could be high-spirited, with jackets off and sleeves rolled up, free to enjoy the pleasures of life. In Hassam's words, just the place for high thinking and low living. For most artists, this excursion to Bohemia, or Old Lyme, began in the hustle and bustle of New York City, one of the fastest-growing cities at the end of the 19th century. It was a place of tall buildings, crowded streets, and trains billowing black smoke and soot into the air. After boarding one of these trains, it took only a few hours of chugging along the Connecticut shore until the artists arrived in Old Saybrook, on the western shore of the Connecticut River. They left the train and were ferried across the river on the Colonial. Once on the Old Lyme side of the river, a wagon or horse-drawn carriage drove them through the village and up Lime Street to the Griswold boarding house, where at last they met their charming hostess, Miss Florence. What a thrill it must have been to enter the cool, shadowy center hall of the house after a long day of travel. Running the length of the house, the wide hallway was a hub of activity. Crowded with the art and antiques that Miss Florence sold to the tourists stopping by for a peek at the artists, the center hall contained the main stairway that led to the bedrooms on the second floor, and from there, a stairway to the maze of makeshift rooms in the attic. Here in the center hall, a newcomer to the house might be introduced to one of his fellow painters while nimbly stepping over scurrying cats and napping dogs. Miss Florence explained what boarders should expect during their stay, including the time of the meals, the fresh pitcher of water that would be placed in each room daily, the kerosene lanterns located at the bottom of the stairs to be used to light the way after dark, and, of course, the location of the outhouse just beyond the flower garden. All this was available for a mere $7 a week, more if they wanted to use one of the ramshackle studios converted from a barn or other farm shacks out back. At last, she delivered the artists to their assigned rooms, where they unpacked their suitcases and trunks of art supplies and collapsed on the bed, weary from a day of travel. This was their home away from home for a week or a month, or however long they decided to stay with Miss Florence and the Lyme Art Colony. Art colonies in the countryside became popular throughout America at the turn of the 20th century, with its revived interest in painting nature and landscape. Instead of working in their city studios, artists wanted to paint en plein air, or out of doors in the country, directly in front of their subject, whether it was a cow standing in a farmer's field or pink mountain laurel ablaze in bloom beside a river. Special tools and paints were created to help the artists work outside. Collapsible easels, folding stools, sun umbrellas, paint boxes, and pre-made paints in squeezable tin tubes all made the job of outdoor painting easier.